Hello, welcome to this SRP webinar on the Nuclear Task Force Regulatory Review, which is, as you'll probably know, colloquially known as the Fingleton report or Fingleton report review. For those that don't know me, I'm Laura Butchins. I'm currently SRP's chair of the Legislation and Standards Committee. My day job is working as a specialist radiological protection inspector for the Office for Nuclear Regulation, the ONR. So the purpose of this webinar is to provide an overview of what the task force recommended, what the government subsequently decided to do in their and said in their response to the report. And the webinar will focus on particular areas of relevance to RP professionals and the profession as a whole. The webinar is just the start of a series of engagements. There'll be a questionnaire launched in the next couple of weeks following the webinar to gather members' views, followed by a workshop in London in September. Details to follow. So the webinar is being recorded and will be available afterwards on SRP's YouTube channel. Please, as usual, ask questions through the Q&A box, and the most voted for questions will be asked, assuming there's time at the end. Any questions we don't have time for, unfortunately, please can you save them for the questionnaire and the workshop. And if you'd like to register your attendance for CPD purposes, please email the code on the screen there to cpd@srpuk.org. And please provide any feedback to the other address events on screen. So yeah, these are the details of the workshop, and you can sign up on the SRP website. As there will be limited space, as we said initially, please only 2 per organisation as a rough guide, and it's open to SRP members only because we want to gather those opinions first, and then if there's space we'll open it up more widely. Just a plug for the next webinar. On the 22nd of October will be 20 years since the poisoning of Alexander Litvinenko. So reflections from that incident. I'd like to introduce all 3 speakers. So our first speaker is Colin Tait, who's currently Deputy Director for Capability and Standards at the Office for Nuclear Regulation, is leading the work to modernise ONR's regulatory guidance, responding to recommendations by the Nuclear Regulatory Task Force. Colin's a chartered mechanical engineer with more than 25 years experience, having worked across nuclear power generation, radioactive waste management and decommissioning. Colin's an advocate of risk-informed regulation and constructive engagement between regulators, industry and stakeholders. And his work focuses on maintaining regulatory excellence, strengthening international harmonisation of regulatory approaches and supporting innovation. Rob Allott, Dr. Rob Allott, will then speak and is currently the Legacy and Waste Strategy Manager within the Environment Agency's Chief Regulators Group. And his team works on policy strategies and legislation in relation to decommissioning and radioactive waste management. Rob also has a lead role on environmental radiological protection, and he represents the Environment Agency on the Committee on Medical Aspects of Radiation in the Environment, CMARI, and he's also represented the UK at the NEA's Committee on Radiological Protection and Public Health, and he's worked at the Environment Agency for over 25 years with previous roles managing Sellafield Nuclear Regulation Team and team responsible for delivering monitoring programmes nationally at and around industrial and nuclear sites. And our last speaker is David Rawlings, who has a background in radiation safety, ionising and non-ionising, having worked as an RPA, a laser protection advisor, and a medical physics expert for a leading healthcare trust. Following retirement in December 2023, David's continued to carry out voluntary work for the SRP, initially as the chair of M4, the Electromagnetic Fields and Optical Radiation Committee, but latterly as the Director of Science and Technology. David has a particular interest in promoting radiation protection as a career. So I better hand over really to our first speaker, Colin.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Just while my slides are coming up, when I was first asked to give this presentation, I must say I hesitated. Firstly, I'm not an RP professional. As Laura says, I'm a mechanical engineer. And secondly, I don't claim any particular authority on the Nuclear Regulatory Task Force. I wasn't a member of the Nuclear Regulatory Task Force. But in my work, I am extremely focused on responding to the Nuclear Regulatory Task Force, and I'm very happy to share my views on the key messages coming out of the report, how the nuclear sector, including ONR, is responding to those recommendations, and I guess along the way I'll try and highlight some of the opportunities that the SRP can influence change and influence the introduction of innovation. Okay, so what was the Nuclear Regulatory Task Force? The Nuclear Regulatory Task Force was commissioned to examine regulation of safety, environment and planning within the nuclear sector, and how that regulation can be improved. The context of the review is really important. So the context is that there's increasing demand and expectation on nuclear to support strategic missions around energy security, clean energy, national security, and of course economic growth. And I guess also the context is that the context of increasing timescales and costs for new nuclear projects in the UK, and I guess an unfavourable increase in comparison to projects in peer nations. The report is a pivotal review for the nuclear sector. The report calls for a radical reset of the sector, calling for change across government, industry and regulators. So despite the title, the recommendations are focused on all actors on the entire nuclear sector, government, regulators and industry. And the report calls for far-reaching changes to address long-standing cultural, structural and process changes in the sector. Three key messages from me are that I think the report is calling for action to address unnecessary and disproportionate risk aversion within the sector. The report asks everybody in the sector to focus less on process and paperwork, to focus more on outcomes and sound risk management. And then finally, the report asks everybody in the sector to consider more the cost of delay when making decisions. So the government responded to the task force report in March, acknowledging all 47 recommendations and committing to implement all 47 recommendations in full. The government response set really clear targets to drive reform forward at pace, and importantly, it identified some really strong governance mechanisms, including the creation of the Nuclear Regulatory Implementation Panel, which is a ministerial-led panel to review progress. And I think also importantly, an important element of governance is the Chancellor's letter to CEOs within the nuclear sector. So a letter to CEOs, both within industry and regulatory bodies, asking for a clear response, setting out what their organisation will do to improve delivery, timescales and cost while delivering the safety and the regulatory standards expected by law. The report is structured around two objectives. The first is reinvigorating Britain's nuclear sector. That objective is primarily focused on safety and safety regulation, and a second recommendation 2, which is really focused around planning and environmental assessment. I'm going to focus my discussion or my presentation on the first objective and then hand over to Rob, who will talk more about objective 2 and environmental, the recommendations relevant to environmental regulation. So the first set of recommendations I want to discuss are around regulatory reform and restructuring. So developers of new nuclear have to engage with a relatively large number of regulators and comply with a large number of, at times, duplicative requirements. Recommendations 2, 3 and 4 aim to streamline regulatory structures. Task Force recommended that defence regulation be streamlined by merging the Defence Nuclear Safety Regulator and the Office for Nuclear Regulation to provide a more coherent regulation of defence nuclear safety. The Task Force also recommends the creation of a nuclear commission to establish a single collective decision-making body for nuclear regulation. And this commission will be empowered to resolve difficult and contentious issues, bringing together regulatory bodies to work together to address difficult and challenging decisions. And I guess it must be noted that other countries around the world have a nuclear regulatory commission, so this recommendation is fairly aimed at transferring international practice that works well into the UK. It was recognised that it would take time to establish a nuclear regulatory commission. The third recommendation I want to talk about is the recommendation to establish a lead regulator. The concept of a lead regulator is that where multiple regulators are engaging with the same or interacting with the same project, one regulator would be identified to coordinate regulation and provide a single interface with the duty holder. The idea is to provide a single shop front for interaction between regulators and duty holders and minimise duplicative requests for similar or the same information. And also to provide a forum where regulators can understand and discuss their decisions to make. The idea is to provide stronger, more integrated decision making. In all three recommendations, really good progress has been made to progress those recommendations. Arrangements have been finalised to implement a lead regulator model, with ONR being appointed as a default lead regulator, working closely with environment agencies, the Health and Safety Executive, the Defence Nuclear Safety Regulator, and importantly, the Planning Inspectorate. And what's the implication on RP professionals? I think there is potential to avoid duplicative submissions and streamline interaction with regulators. And perhaps work better to interact with regulators to focus on optimal regulatory decisions, so that risk management is optimized across different categories of risk and regulation. The next recommendation I want to talk about is recommendation 5, which calls for a reset in nuclear safety cases. The task force calls for a reset in nuclear safety cases to restore the purpose of the safety case as a tool for duty holders to inform sound risk management. There's a feeling within the task force that the purpose of safety cases had drifted, providing information to a large number of different stakeholders, including regulators, and the recommendation calls for a firm reset to restore the purpose to restore safety cases to be owned by operators and to reduce complexity and loss of clarity. And it's interesting, work was done in the nuclear sector 10 or 15 years ago following Haddon Cave's Nimrod inquiry to simplify safety cases. And the task force makes it clear that more needs to be done to implement the findings of the Haddon Cave report in the nuclear sector. So in response, again, good progress has been made to respond to this recommendation. ONR has recently reissued guidance on safety cases, simplifying quite a potentially complex set of expectations, simplifying those expectations and clearly stating what's required to produce a sound safety case. And we are working with industry to implement those expectations, working with a safety case, the Safety Directors Forum, to implement the challenge and the change required by the task force. Our new guidance includes recognition that fundamentally the overarching requirement is to produce an adequate safety case, an adequate risk assessment. And there is our new guidance, which was issued last month, indicates an open-mindedness to whether risk assessment is covered in a safety case or whether it's covered in an IRR's risk assessment. Again, the aim is to avoid duplication and streamline expectations. The next recommendation I just want to highlight is recommendation 10, which is about avoiding conflation or mixing up of nuclear safety controls with conventional health and safety risks. So faults that could result in a major nuclear safety accident rightly are required to have stringent controls in place to prevent that occurring. The task force challenged the sector as to whether these expectations are drifted towards low hazards and conventional health and safety expectations, and is challenging the sector to ensure that controls are clearly proportionate to hazard and risk. And although the recommendation is quite clearly focused on potential drift between nuclear safety and radiological safety controls into conventional health and safety risk management, there is some discussion and reflection around whether the level of the quality expectations and integrity expectations for faults which could result in a major societal disruption, are they also is that level of integrity and expectation drifting into lower hazard faults, and faults which are predominantly radiological protection related. The next recommendation I've been asked to talk about is the tolerability of risk. So the task force reviewed how the industry implements a really important publication which is called the Tolerability of Risk, which sets out societal risk acceptance and how that relates to the nuclear sector. The task force recommends that government review how that work is implemented in practice. And in order to do that, government has tasked an organisation called NIRO to set up an expert panel to review the implementation of tolerability risk across the nuclear sector and into nuclear regulatory requirements. I think importantly, it's quite clear from the government's response that that work does not intend to look at or revisit the L&T model, but is focused on how the tolerability risk and numerical targets are implemented in practice across the sector and within regulatory expectations. This recommendation is a key part of my work. So recommendation 7 asks that regulators review their guidance and ensure that their guidance is appropriate for a predominantly goal-setting regulatory regime. The report asks regulators to review their guidance and ensure that the guidance clearly articulates and is focused on articulating the desired outcomes, moving away from long and complex expectations and complex guidance. This work is a really significant piece of work for all regulators, but ONR in particular. ONR's made a really good start at reviewing its guidance. We've reviewed perhaps most important safety guidance, which is effectively called the safety assessment principles, which aims to set out the principles required to be demonstrated within nuclear safety cases. We've undertaken, since the task force report has been published, we have completed a full and substantial review of our safety assessment principles, ensuring that our safety assessment principles are fully aligned with modern international expectations for nuclear safety. The work has focused on implementing and ensuring that our safety assessment principles clearly communicated and are aligned with a graded approach. And we've done some work, really important work, to review our numerical risk targets, again, in line with some of the observations made in the task force and reviewing those expectations in line with modern international expectations. We intend to make a number of changes to our safety assessment principles, including safety assessment principles related to radiological protection. So next week, we will intend to launch a public consultation on proposed revision of our safety assessment principles. And members of SRP will be interested to review the proposed changes to the RP principles. And you will note that we intend to simplify the RP principles, going from, I think, 7 principles in the current extant guidance to 3. The aim isn't to change the outcomes we expect, but simply to refocus our principles on at a principle level, and then ensure that supporting detail is provided in lower level guidance. So I think there's a real opportunity for SRP and SRP members to engage in that consultation, which runs from 8 weeks from Monday. And it's a real opportunity for all members of the profession to shape change within the nuclear sector and our regulatory framework. The task force also made a really important recommendation around regulatory justification. The task force proposed quite significant legislative change to streamline and simplify the process by which practices involving ionising regulation are justified within the nuclear sector. Some really significant work is being taken up to implement those recommendations with an organisation called Great British Nuclear, preparing a justification for which would simplify the approach for light water reactors. And then there's some more significant changes being evaluated within government to streamline the entire process. The task force made some another really important recommendation around international strategy. The UK is extremely influential on the international stage, and the task force made a number of recommendations to improve the effectiveness of our engagement internationally, improving greater collaboration between regulators and industry, and aiming to try and improve how we influence international standards and the development of future international standards. So I'm just conscious my time is using up my time, so I'm just going to quickly go through a couple of key messages. So I believe that the Nuclear Regulatory Task Force provides a real opportunity for those working in the nuclear sector, for the public and for government to improve the effectiveness of the nuclear regulatory regime. I think some real opportunities to shape future and improve regulatory policy and regulation, and I really do encourage organisations to get involved in the SAPS consultation, get involved in the expert panel on tolerability of risk and provide expert views to that work. And I think finally, there are real significant opportunities for everybody working and involved in the sector to review and improve the culture, ensuring that everybody in the sector is much more focused on outcomes and risk management, and ensure that we can safely deliver the government's ambitions. So I guess what I want to do now is hand over to Rob, who's going to talk us through the implications to environmental regulation. Over to you, Rob.
Very much, Colin. I'm going to focus on the recommendations more relevant to the Environment Agency, which are in addition to the one that Colin has mentioned. So I'm going to pick up on recommendation 7 again and talk about the Environment Agency's elements within that. Also recommendation 22, which is proportionate regulatory control of radioactively contaminated structures and infrastructure. And finally, recommendation 23, which is proportionality in permitting for decommissioning activities. And these are the recommendations that are really of more of interest to RP professionals in that environmental area. So picking up the recommendation 7 first, there is an ask as well as on ONR. This is an ask on the Environment Agency as well to review our areas of guidance. And it's probably just worth pointing out that many of the environmental RP standards are actually in legislation or government policy rather than being set by ourselves. And the areas of guidance that we'll be looking at and targeting as part of the review will be our guidance on principles of optimization in the management and disposal of radioactive waste, our limit setting guidance for discharges of radioactive waste, assessing prospective public doses from authorised discharges. Worth saying that we've already undertaken a review and a technical review externally of that guidance, And one of the elements that's proposed to change within that guidance is moving our threshold of where we would expect a detailed assessment to be undertaken, and moving that to 0.1 millisieverts per year. It's currently at 0.02 millisieverts per year. And then also, as Colin mentioned, our guidance on requirements for authorising radioactive waste disposal facilities, and our guidance on requirements for release of sites from radioactive substances regulation. And the RP community might want to think about what they would like to see in the Environment Agency's guidance to ensure proportionality. We generally seek comments on our external guidance as we're reviewing it, so there's an opportunity to provide your comments there. Moving on to recommendation 22. This is essentially about the proportionate regulatory control of end-of-life decommissioning of nuclear sites. And many of you may be familiar that within the Energy Act in 2023, the legislation was put in place but not enacted yet to enable the exclusion of decommissioning once certain criteria have been met from licensing, and then move that into the regime controlled by the Health and Safety Executive and Environment Agencies. So government have committed to looking at getting the additional legislation that's required to be put in place to complete that regime, but are also looking at and wishing to explore opportunities for more proportionate practices within current regulations. So in terms of the RP profession, I think there's an opportunity there to think about what are those proportionate practices in the regulation of radioactively contaminated structures and infrastructure, and also how the RP profession can support the implementation of PRC once government have managed to enact that in full. And then finally from me is recommendation 23, which is around the proportionality in permitting for decommissioning activities. So a number of components within this recommendation. The first one isn't an RP related matter, but it's about exemptions for stockpiling materials on nuclear sites, in particular excavation material, that kind of thing, and storing it for longer periods. The arrangements between MOD, NDA and regulators to speed up decision making in decommissioning, and that very much links to what Colin was talking about around that lead nuclear regulator concept. Clear roles and responsibilities for different environmental assessments, and also making sure that the distinct functions of EIADR are implemented as intended. The fourth one is very much focused on the environment agencies, and this is around our guidance on requirements for authorization, and DESNE is working with us to make sure that it's clear, fair and proportionate. And then finally, another one that isn't really relevant to the RP community, which is new permitted development rights for to support decommissioning. So this is in relation to planning aspects for small scale infrastructure facilities, etc., that support decommissioning. So thinking again what the RP profession might want to think about, your views on how ONR and EA in particular can work closer together on decommissioning sites might be something you'd wish to think about. What concerns you might have about how EIADR is implemented, and how the RP profession can ensure that there is proportionality in the application of the GRA to radioactive waste disposal facilities. So those are my few slides, and I'm now going to pass over to David.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody. I think it's very apt that we move towards the end of this presentation with some consideration of training and recruitment. because my interest in training and recruitment and retention, it is essentially recently been through SRP. We've got a working group looking at the whole area of this. We are not alone. A lot of other organizations and a lot of other professional bodies consider this to be a major problem currently, and really needs to be addressed in a broad manner. So I think it's very apt that we have a look at what this particular the nuclear report actually has to say about that. So let's have a look at my slides. So first of all, let's just have a look at what the report actually says. So this is a direct quote. So from the Building Our Nuclear Nation, the report indicated below. What it essentially says is probably something that I think most people would have thought was fairly obvious, that over the years, recruitment and retention of staff has not really kept up with what is required, particularly as we are aware there's going to be an expansion of the workforce in the nuclear sector. So it's essentially it's laying out the groundwork for what needs to be done. Let's just have a look, and we'll dig a little bit deeper as to what they propose, what is suggested within this regulatory review. So they've referred to the Nuclear Skills Plan. Now, this has actually been going for a little while. It was started in November 2024, and Colin mentioned fragmentation at the start of this webinar. Now, I think that probably characterized the whole situation in terms of recruitment and training and so on. And what this looks at and what this proposes is bringing together of all organizations that have an interest within the nuclear sector. And that's not just the individual companies, but also government, industry and education providers and so on. We've actually put a number on that. So 24,000 additional jobs in the nuclear sector by 2030. Now that's really quite ambitious. And so in other words, the pressure is on. So how are they going to do this? What are they proposing in order to provide that number of new jobs, that number of new positions within the industry? So first of all, bursaries. Now this is looking at those people who perhaps wouldn't consider going to university, wouldn't perhaps be able to afford going to university, but are particularly talented and therefore would otherwise be lost to the workforce in general, but particularly the nuclear workforce. So there are bursaries available for education and professional development. So that's kind of ticking that box. And then sponsorship. Now this is looking more directly at STEM graduates. And so such things as summer placements, there's bursaries as well, been mentioned again, and guaranteed jobs. Now, clearly, the guaranteed jobs is quite an attraction at the end of the training. So those are the first two. So this is all about expanding the workforce, as you can see I've put at the top there. How are people going to know about opportunities that might be available? Well, there's another of these flashy titles. This one is Destination Nuclear. This is essentially a depository for opportunities that might be available. It could, for example, be jobs for new graduates. It could be advertising apprenticeships. It could be for secondments, or it could be advertising for experienced workers. And there's a very clear indication, if you look down the website, as to which of those categories applies. So once again, we're losing the fragmentation that we had before. And this is a central repository for ensuring that we maximize the opportunities that might be available. So going up to, if you like, the next stage, doctoral focal awards. So this is supporting advanced research and skills development. So it's supporting that side of the work. So still looking to expand the workforce, and this time this is fast track routes. So there may well be people outside the nuclear sector in perhaps engineering jobs and so on who would be interested to move to the nuclear sector, particularly with changes in job opportunities and so on. And so there is a fast track route to ensure that is made possible, that the optimize the possibilities of the existing workforce outside nuclear. So transitioning into nuclear roles. So these are all, if you like, these are all projects, aspects to optimize to optimize recruitment and to optimize getting those jobs filled, if you like. What about the existing workforce? What about strengthening the workforce that we already have? Well, there are a few things that they have to say about that. Well, first of all, secondment across public, private, and regulatory sectors. So, in other words, it's broadening the possibilities, opening up doors that might not previously be available, increasing experience, making work life, I suppose, more attractive to people who have been there for a wee while. And importantly, and I think this probably strikes a bell with older workers, enhancing knowledge transfer for retiring specialists. So we don't want to lose that experience. We want to have a process for making sure that there's proper transfer. And finally, mentoring. Well, I think mentoring has been discussed in quite detail. There are times when mentoring can be really quite useful. It kind of points people in the right direction. It helps people individually in their careers, and there's a scheme set up for that. And also, right at the end, training to include human factors, digital, and so on. So that's, if you like, right at the end there. These are areas that perhaps haven't been explored fully previously, and there's an opportunity to look into that. I'm going to say a little bit more about the digital program very, very briefly. Applying digital technologies, so all these sort of things that are brand new coming through, and things that perhaps would be appropriate to include in a little in a proper project sort of situation like this. Training to upskill future and existing staff. Now, in AI and digital skills, certainly that's one of those areas that perhaps would need to be encouraged. So that is the programme. As I say, I've taken all of these words directly from the publication, so I haven't invented any of this. But it's perhaps appropriate to look right at the end at how that relates to the broader radiation protection profession as a whole. So from my point of view, what is SRP doing about retraining? Important to note, of course, that this applies to across the whole of the RP profession. So we do have several groups within SRP that are looking at this whole area. As I said before, there's a recruitment and retention working group. There's a rising generation group which supports workers within radiation safety, radiation protection within the first 10 years of their work. And there's an outreach group which goes out to schools and promotes that sort of area. So there's a few phrases that I put right at the end here of the sort of things that we are looking at currently within those sort of groups. Well, first of all, raising awareness generally. That's important. Promoting chartership. As most people will know today, SRP has a chartership scheme, and that can be useful within a profession. Supporting training and mentoring generally, and importantly, defining a career pathway. So getting away from this whole idea of a fragmented approach. RP has many, many different employers, and it's perhaps appropriate to kind of hone in a little bit and define what an RP profession actually looks like and what a career path might look like. So that's pretty much what I wanted to say, and thank you for listening.
Thank you, David, and thank you to all the speakers.